"Sir, could you marry my blind mama?" The words stopped Roan Calter cold, right as he stepped toward the train that was supposed to take him far from everything he didn't want to remember. He turned slowly, expecting a joke or a drunken passenger. But instead, he found a boy no older than 6, his hat too big, his eyes too steady. Roan blinked at him, unsure if he'd heard right. "What did you say?" The boy nodded solemnly, clutching a wrinkled flower in his hand. "Just for today. She won't know you're not who she thinks." Roan followed the boy's small hand as it pointed toward the end of the platform, where a young woman sat with her back straight and her eyes unfocused. She was beautiful, but not in the way most folks noticed. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her dress clean but old, and beside her rested a white cane. Roan's gut twisted. "Why me?" he asked. The boy shrugged. "You looked kind enough, and you're the only one who stopped." Roan wanted to laugh, to say the boy was wrong on both counts, but the train's whistle blew, and he looked back again. Something about the way she sat so still, waiting without asking, made it hard to keep walking. He was no savior, no romantic. He'd buried too much of himself in other towns and had nothing left to offer, not even his name. But there was something in the way the boy stood, brave but trembling, that broke past Rowan's silence. "What's your name, son?" he asked. "Micah," the boy whispered, "and hers is Hattie." "She thinks Papa came back today." Rowan swallowed hard. "She think you're him?" Micah nodded. "She don't know he's dead." And just like that, Roan Calter stepped off the platform and into something he didn't understand. He knelt down, brushing dust off Micah's shoulder. "All right," he said, voice quiet. "But just for today." The boy's eyes lit up with something that wasn't quite relief. It was older than that. Roan walked with him to Hattie, unsure what to say, unsure what she'd see in a man like him. But when she turned her face slightly toward his footsteps and smiled, Roan felt more seen in that moment than he had in years. "Is that you?" she asked softly. Roan looked down at the woman waiting for a ghost, and answered like a man who wasn't running anymore. "Yeah, darling, it's me." Hattie reached out slowly, her fingers brushing Roan's coat sleeve like she was trying to recognize a dream by feel. "Your coat's different," she said gently, smiling as if it were a game. Roan froze, but Micah stepped in, clutching her hand. "It got torn last week, remember? Papa had to buy a new one." Hattie laughed softly, the sound as light as wind through prairie grass. "That's right. I always forget what day it is lately." Roan studied her face. There was no question in her eyes, only trust, blind but unshakable. She saw through memory, not sight. It rattled him more than any confrontation ever had. "Did the train get in all right?" she asked, tilting her head toward the noise now fading behind them. Roan cleared his throat. "Yeah. On time." It was the first lie he'd told without regret in years. Hattie turned slightly, as if she could still feel the shape of her husband standing beside her. "You smell like pine now. Did you ride through the mountains?" Yeah, took the long way," Roan said. He watched as she nodded, her fingers reaching for Micah's again, grounding herself. Roan felt like an intruder in a life carefully held together by silence and softness. But she didn't seem afraid. If anything, she looked calm for the first time in years. They walked together slowly, Hattie's cane tapping against the boards, Micah guiding them both like he'd done it 100 times. They reached the edge of the station, where a borrowed cart waited. Roan helped her up, his hands trembling just slightly as they brushed her waist. She didn't flinch. "Home's not far," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "You hungry?" Roan hesitated. Always. That made her laugh again. Good. I made stew this morning. You always liked my stew. Roan couldn't help the way something cracked open inside him. He hadn't been spoken to like that in years, not like he was someone worth feeding, worth waiting for. As the wheels bumped down the dirt road, Hattie began humming a lullaby. Micah leaned against Roan's arm, silent and small, as if afraid to breathe too loudly and wake up from whatever this was. Roan stared at the road ahead, trying not to notice how natural it felt to sit between them. He didn't know how long he could keep this up, or what she'd do when the truth came. But for now, she believed he was the man she loved. And somehow, that made Roan want to become him. Roan sat outside that night, on the crooked porch that faced a field of wild grass silvered by moonlight. Micah had fallen asleep curled next to Hattie, and Roan hadn't moved from that spot since tucking the boy in. He held the sheriff's badge in his hand. Still scratched, still smeared with blood from the day he'd pulled it from the baby's crib in the river. He turned it over slowly, the way one turns over a sin. In town, this badge had meant power. But out here, under Hattie's soft gaze and Micah's quiet devotion, it felt more like a burden. The woman inside that cabin had looked into his face and seen her husband. Not because he looked like him, he didn't, but because her mind had stitched that memory into place so tightly she couldn't pull it loose without tearing everything else. And now she was humming lullabies to a man who had killed for a living. A man who didn't believe he deserved warmth or soup or the trust in a child's hand. Roan had told himself he'd stay one night, just until he could find the real family. But Hattie had called him by name, Jude, and smiled with such peace that Roan hadn't corrected her, hadn't spoken the truth, hadn't said that Jude was likely dead or drunk in another town, or worse. And maybe that made Roan a coward, or maybe it made him something else. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Micah, barefoot and blinking, stepped onto the porch and sat beside him. "You're not going to leave, are you?" the boy asked. His voice cracked like dry wood. Roan looked away. "I was thinking I should." Micah was quiet, staring out at the stars. "You make her laugh," he whispered. "She ain't laughed like that in a long time." Roan swallowed. "She thinks I'm someone I'm not." "You think I don't know that?" Micah said, finally turning to him. "I ain't dumb. I remember Jude. You don't look nothing like him. But Mama, she sees things in her heart, not her eyes. And for some reason, you're who she needs right now." Roan didn't answer. He just held the badge tighter until the metal dug into his palm. Micah leaned his head on Roan's shoulder. "She'll die if she loses you again. I know it." The words landed heavier than any lawman's oath. And when Roan finally stood, he left the badge behind on the porch railing, gleaming under the moonlight like a choice made and sealed. The cabin smelled of warm cornmeal and wood smoke by morning, but Hattie's hands trembled as she folded Micah's shirt. Roan had gone to chop firewood, at least that's what he'd said, but something in the air felt like goodbye. She sat by the small hearth, folding and unfolding the same piece of cloth, her mind looping on things she hadn't dared ask. She didn't know where he came from, didn't know why he carried that badge with such quiet shame. And most of all, she didn't know why her son had clung to him so fast, so fiercely, as if love could be transferred like breath from one mouth to another. She looked over at the crib. The baby stirred under the blanket, tiny fists twitching in sleep, face soft and oblivious to the weight in the room. "I don't even know your name," she whispered, brushing the infant's brow. Outside, the axe thunked into wood. Steady, like a heartbeat, like something trying to stay grounded. Hattie rose. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, arms folded against the chill. Roan looked up from the chopping block. Sweat glistened at his temple. He didn't smile. He never did. "Why did you come back?" she asked plainly. Roan paused mid-swing, then let the axe sink into the stump. "Because you buried the badge and kept the baby," he said. "Most people would have done the opposite." Hattie blinked. "You saw?" "I was the one who pulled that crib from the river." Her breath caught. "But I thought—" "You were too busy crying," he said gently. "I stayed in the woods till I knew you were safe. Then I walked into town and saw the men whispering. I came back." "To do what?" she asked, her voice cracking. "To see what kind of woman takes in a child with blood on its name and buries the law like it never existed." She swallowed hard. "Do you think I'm a fool?" "I think you're the bravest person I've ever seen." He stepped closer. "But I also think you're lying to yourself. You know I'm not Jude." "I do," she whispered. "But I wanted to believe someone came back." Roan nodded slowly. "Then believe this. I didn't come here to pretend. I came because the second I saw that baby's eyes, I knew he wasn't meant for the river, and maybe I ain't meant to leave either." Hattie looked down. "Will you stay, Roan?" He didn't answer with words. He just picked up the folded shirt from her hands, opened the door, and went inside like he belonged. It didn't take long for the town to notice. First came the sideways glances when Hattie walked into the mercantile with a man beside her and a baby against her chest. Then came the silences, those sharp, unnatural pauses that cut off laughter as soon as she entered a room. By Sunday, the whispers had bloomed like mold behind closed doors. She took in a murderer's child. He carries no past, no family, no name. Wasn't there blood on that river? Hattie heard it all without hearing a word. It clung to her as she walked past the post office, where Miss Dory leaned a little too far out the window, eyes hawk-sharp. Roan, for his part, moved like smoke, quiet, controlled, aware. He never left her side unless it was to gather wood or fetch water, and even then he returned quickly. He said little, but when he did, it was with purpose. That afternoon, a knock rattled the cabin door. Hattie opened it to find Sheriff Ellery standing tall on the porch, hat in hand, eyes unreadable. "Hattie," he said, "we need to talk." Roan stepped into the doorway beside her, arms folded. The sheriff's gaze didn't flinch. "Folks are nervous. Said you pulled a badge out the river and never brought it to me." Hattie didn't blink. "I buried it. Didn't think it belonged to anyone anymore." "Every badge belongs to something," Ellery replied. "Even ghosts." He turned to Roan. "And you? Got a last name?" Roan's jaw tightened. "Don't see how that matters unless I've broken a law." "No law yet," the sheriff said slowly. "But something's off. A baby don't float down from nowhere with a knife and a badge unless there's a story. I came to hear it before someone else decides to write their own." Hattie stepped forward. "I found the child. I buried the past. That's all there is." Ellery looked at her for a long moment. Then he sighed, nodded once, and tipped his hat. "You've always been a good soul, Hattie. Don't let that baby turn you into a fool." As he walked away, Roan muttered, "Too late." She looked up. "What do you mean?" "He's right," Roan said. "There is a story. But if I tell it, everything will change." Hattie stared at him, the baby stirring in her arms. "Then you better be sure I can carry it." Roan didn't answer. But later that night, he placed the knife from the crib on the table between them and whispered, "The man this belonged to wasn't just a sheriff. He was my brother." The knife looked simple at first. Plain handle, worn leather grip, dull from use. But Hattie could tell by the way Roan's fingers lingered on it that it carried weight beyond steel. The fire crackled between them, throwing shadows up the log walls as he sat across from her, gaze fixed on the blade. "His name was Caleb," Roan said at last. "Caleb Stratton, sheriff of Broken Ridge, and my older brother." Hattie blinked. You're not from anywhere near here." "No," he said. "Not anymore. I left the territory years ago after our father died. Caleb stayed behind, took up the badge like Pa. Last I heard, he'd married. No children. But then..." He looked at the baby, sleeping in Hattie's arms. "Then I started dreaming of him, standing in a river, holding out that same knife, telling me, 'Come find her.' I thought I was going mad, but then I came west, just wandered. Something pulled me." Hattie's skin prickled. "And when you got here?" "I followed the water." "Always the water. I wasn't even near your land, but that night, the storm, I stopped to rest under a cottonwood and heard crying. That's when I saw the crib, wedged between the rocks. When I pulled it free, I found the baby, and the knife, same one from the dreams." His voice broke then. "And a badge." His badge. Hattie stared at him. "You think this baby's his?" "I know it," Roan said. "The cheekbones, the scar over the eye. That baby's blood is mine too." Silence filled the room. Hattie looked down at the child. So small, so warm, so deeply tangled in this tale of blood and water and loss. "Then why not go to the sheriff?" she asked. "Clear your name, claim the child." Roan shook his head. "I'm not the man they want. I'm half Comanche, Hattie. They'd say I stole the child, killed Caleb, made it all up. They'd take her. Or worse." Hattie's throat tightened. "Then why tell me?" "Because you didn't ask who I was when I showed up. You just handed me a blanket and a plate." He looked up, firelight flickering in his dark eyes. "You're the only one who might believe me." Hattie stood and crossed the room. She didn't speak. She just reached out, placed the sleeping baby in Roan's arms, and whispered, "Then she's ours now. And the story begins here, not in the river." Roan didn't cry, but his fingers trembled as he held the child closer, like something sacred had been returned. The next morning, the wind carried bird song instead of thunder, and Hattie stepped barefoot onto the porch with a basin in her arms, and the baby still nestled against her shoulder. Roan was already out front, cutting firewood with slow, methodical strokes, as if he had nowhere else to be and nothing to hide from anymore. Hattie watched him for a long moment, the muscles in his back moving beneath the linen shirt she'd washed and stitched the night before. He looked up only when she set the basin down and dipped her hands into the water. "You sleep?" he asked, voice low, cautious. "Barely," she replied. "The baby cries like she's remembering something terrible." Roan nodded slowly. "She's young, but memory sits in the bones, too." Hattie studied him, brushing a lock of hair from the baby's face. "What will you call her?" Roan didn't answer right away. He came up the porch steps and looked down at the child. "Callan," he said. "Not Caleb, Callan. It's Comanche for light in the storm." Hattie nodded. "Then Callan it is." They stood there together for a long stretch, not quite touching, but near enough to feel the heat of each other's breath. Roan looked toward the river in the distance. "Someone's going to come looking for her eventually. If that badge belonged to Caleb, someone's missing both him and his blood." Hattie stiffened. "Then we don't let them take her. We say she's yours and mine." The words slipped out before she realized what they meant, but she didn't take them back. Roan looked at her sharply, but not in alarm, more like awe. "You'd do that?" he asked, "even if it puts you in danger?" "She was left in my river, Roan," Hattie whispered. "That makes her mine. And you followed that same river to get here. That makes you mine too, if you want to be." For a long second, He didn't move. Then Roan did something he hadn't done in all the days since he'd appeared. He smiled. Just slightly, just enough. "Then I reckon I'll build a second crib," he said, "and start cutting more firewood." That night, they laid Callan down in the old bassinet Hattie had once made for a child she never got to raise. She watched Roan carefully carve the name into the frame. Callan Stratton. No one asked Hattie if she wanted a family again. But now she had one, named not by blood, but by choice, and carried in silence until it was safe to speak aloud. 3 days later, just after dawn, a rider appeared on the edge of the pasture, tall, lean, and dressed in a deputy's coat gone sun-faded at the seams. Hattie saw him first through the kitchen window while feeding Callan mashed oats. Roan stepped out to meet the man before his boots even touched the porch. They talked low, but not low enough to hide from Hattie's ears. "You're Roan Stratton?" the man asked. "I am," Roan said. His hand, resting gently near the axe, leaned against the wall. "Name's Deputy Harrow. Been riding out from Lincoln, following a trail that went cold by the river. You wouldn't know anything about a man named Caleb Dunn, would you?" Roan didn't blink. "No." Harrow pulled something from his saddlebag. A crumpled wanted poster, half torn, with a sketch of Caleb's face. "That man was suspected of robbing a bank. Sheriff sent me after him. Word was he might have come this way with something stolen." Roan's jaw tightened. "All I've seen is this ranch and the woman who runs it." "And the baby?" Harrow asked, tilting his head toward the sound of Callan's muffled cry from inside. Roan looked him square in the eye. "My daughter." The deputy didn't move for a beat. "Strange," he muttered. "There was a crib downstream. Empty. Sheriff said Caleb had a child with him when he ran." Roan didn't answer. Hattie stepped onto the porch then, holding Callan close. "You're scaring my child," she said quietly, her voice firm but calm. Harrow looked at her, then at the child, who gurgled softly. His eyes narrowed. "That baby got a name?" "Callan Stratton," Hattie replied. "Born here, raised here." Harrow stared another moment, then sighed, folding the poster and sliding it back into his coat. "I've been riding too long to pick a fight with a family who's already built their own peace. You've got the face of a man who's done running. I'll leave it there." Roan nodded. "You do that?" Harrow turned without another word, mounted up, and rode away slowly, leaving only dust behind. When he vanished past the ridge, Hattie's knees gave out slightly, and Roan caught her. "You lied for her," she whispered. Roan shook his head. "I told the truth. She is mine, and so are you." And for the first time in years, Hattie let herself believe in something safer than silence, stronger than blood, and more lasting than fear. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Hattie carried Callan out into the yard. The air was crisp, the earth damp from a night's light rain. Roan stood by the barn, watching her as she knelt in the soft dirt near the porch, the baby snug in her arms. Slowly, with her free hand, she reached down and traced a name into the wet soil. Callan Dunn Stratton. Roan stepped forward, quiet as always. "Why both?" he asked. Hattie looked up at him, her eyes calm, no longer afraid. "Because he deserves to know where he came from, but also where he belongs." Roan nodded, then crouched beside her, adding a careful line beneath the name, then pressing his palm gently into the mud beneath it, as if sealing it. "Then he'll never forget either." Callan cooed and reached out, his tiny fingers brushing Roan's shirt. Hattie smiled at the sight, the child's innocence, the man's silent loyalty. And beneath that moment lay something unspoken, something that had been waiting to bloom. Trust. Inside the cabin, the fire still glowed warm, the scent of wood smoke wrapping the home like a blanket. Their shared routines, milking, chopping, humming lullabies, had woven themselves into a quiet rhythm. No ceremony had named them a family. No one had granted permission. But here, with a baby born of violence and rescued from silence, it was happening anyway. That night, after Callan had fallen asleep, Hattie stepped out and found Roan seated on the porch, sharpening a tool in the lantern light. She sat beside him. "Do you think he'll always wonder?" she asked. "About who his father was?" Roan didn't look up. "Maybe. But I think he'll care more about who stayed." The words settled between them like truth carved into stone. Then, hesitantly, Hattie reached for his hand. "You've already given him more than blood ever could." Roan paused, then turned his palm upward, letting her fingers fold into his. "And you've given me something I thought was gone forever." She rested her head on his shoulder. For the first time in years, the stars above looked soft, not distant. Callan stirred once inside, then went quiet again. And with her name no longer buried in silence, and his heart no longer hiding behind fences, they sat side by side, two survivors who hadn't planned for love, but had found it growing between riverbanks, rifles, and the scarred cradle of a child's second chance. The townsfolk never spoke of that morning again. Not the crate in the river, not the badge or the knife. But rumors grew quiet when Roan and Hattie walked into church with Callan, nestled between them, his small hands gripping each of theirs. The preacher paused, unsure, then gave a silent nod. No one stood to protest. No one dared. They sat together on the last bench, unnoticed only because they no longer needed anyone's permission to belong. That spring Hattie planted a garden. Roan added a second room to the cabin with his own hands. They made space, not just for a child, but for peace. Callan took his first steps on the porch Roan built, saying "Ma" before any other word. The rifle that had once defended them now hung quiet over the fireplace, and the sheriff's badge rested in a small wooden box, locked away, its truth buried deeper than the river that once carried it. One day, when Callan was old enough to ask where he came from, Hattie planned to tell him. Not about the violence, but about the choice, that he had been chosen, fiercely and fully, that love had claimed him where the law had not, and that sometimes family begins not with blood or names, but with the moment someone refuses to walk away. That summer, an old man passed through town and said he'd once known a marshal named Dunn who vanished after his badge went missing. He looked at the boy, then looked away. No one followed the lead. No one wanted to disturb what had finally settled. And Hattie, who once thought her voice didn't matter, began to write. Stories of mothers who stayed, of quiet men who protected without words, of rivers that returned what the world tried to throw away. She wrote at night when Roan had fallen asleep with Callan on his chest, their breathing in sync. She wrote because she could, because her story had found its ending. But mostly she wrote so Callan would know the truth. That the girl who once stood crying with a baby in her arms was never just a victim or a mystery. She was a mother, a fighter, a name worth remembering. And the Lakota man who laid down his rifle had done so not to surrender, but to make room for love, for something better than survival, for a life. By the time Callan turned 5, he had stopped asking about the river, because everything he needed was already here, safe, chosen, home. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had found that crib in the river, what would you have done? Tell us in the comments.